Hi everyone, welcome back to my show. I'm Joe Alvarez. Alrighty, so the next thing I want to talk about is the book that I think anyone who looks at any art should read. Now, it's specifically about books, so that might give you some hesitation, but I think we can approach any form of art, whether it be books, movies, paintings, poetry, whether it's literary or if it's visual or if it's audio. You could have it for music as well. You should read this book if that's kind of your thing. It is possibly one of the most underrated and overlooked books by C.S. Lewis. It is, in fact, a Lewis classic titled An Experiment in Criticism. Now, the Cambridge professor became popular to many of us as children through the children's books, The Chronicles of Narnia, and he's also written many poetic and philosophical, theological books, and I think, as well as writing all those stories, not only The Chronicles of Narnia, but the Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce, the and the science fiction novels, which for some odd reason are coming up blank to me. I must confess I never read them, which is possibly why I do not remember what they're called. But because he is such a good author, and because he has read so much, he was a very successful Cambridge and Oxford professor. That I would trust him on this book, and obviously I do trust him. I think it's a book that anyone who wants to judge or critique art should read. Why is that? Well, uh, his whole premise is flipping the standard on its head. The standard for the conventional way of criticizing books in his day, they didn't criticize movies quite as often, or that wasn't quite as popular. Uh, you judge a book by its content, and then those who considered themselves literary or at least fashionable would go ahead and read those books that were thought to be good and wouldn't read those books that were condemned so easily by critics. Now, what he does, where the critic would judge the book and then that would tell everyone what kind of a reader you were, and if you read a book that was condemned by a critic, you were obviously a bad literary reader or a bad reader of good literature or a reader of bad literature, then that was just who you were. But what Lewis does is he looks at the different kinds of reading and not what people would read, but how they would read it. He starts with that. And he would start with the type of reader you were. He then moves from that to what kind of books are worth reading. As he says himself, rather than have the book be the premise and the type of reader, the corollary, which is a logical conclusion, he goes ahead and makes the type of reader the premise and the type of book the corollary. So you can see that the effects of the book then determine the quality of the book rather than simply the author's own position of it, if that makes any sense to you. The critic's own position of it, or even possibly the author of the book. So, for your convenience, I'll give you the takeaways I had from the book, but I highly recommend you go on thrift books or eBay. I got mine, I believe, off of eBay. Had it since it was recommended to me for my college thesis, and I've loved it ever since. It's very insightful and incisive. It really cuts down to what kind of reader you are, and it's encouraged me to even just read more books along with watching movies and things like that. I highly recommend you read it for yourself because it tends to provide more information, more context, and you get a clearer picture of it. Because and it's only about 150 pages. It's a very short read, and C.S. Lewis can explain philosophy or theology or books to you as though you were a 5-year-old, and it's fantastic. So he starts off with the preposition, which I've already laid out for you. You have the readers as the premise and the books as the corollary, rather than the other way around. So the readers, their interactions, their reactions, and their re-interactions with books, meaning like rereading the book, would say something about the type of book that they were reading, rather than someone saying one thing about the book and then having that label on the book itself determine the kind of reader you were, or even or are, or even if you qualify as a literary person in the first place. And that's the next thing he talks about is the literary versus the unliterary. So he makes several distinctions of what the unliterary will do or won't do with regards to reading. Often they are the ones who will read a book that has surface level value and then never read again. He makes a reference that a woman has to. You'll see it sometimes. See a woman, and this could go for men too, but he says woman. You'll see a woman that cannot remember whether she's read a book and has to go through half the book just to even remember whether she's read the book. But then he puts the unliterary, who at best read for entertainment in a boring moment, in comparison with the literary, who will read of their own accord, of their own pleasure, of their own leisure. To put the Shakespearean rhyme in play there. And of course, he naturally assumes himself a literary person, and well, that makes sense because he's a literature English professor at Cambridge and in Oxford. So then he delves deeper a little further by parsing out the different ways in which one might be unliterary. You may read a book for all the wrong reasons, and of course, keep in mind he's talking about reading books which are pieces of fiction, works of fiction, and so none of this, not much of this, will apply to nonfiction. So one thing that an unliterary person might read is just for egoistic castle building, he calls it. And if you read the book, you'll learn more about that. But it's just like putting yourself into a story just to satisfy your pleasures. Now, there is some catharsis, and he talks about that at the very, very end of the book. And he has some opinions about that. But that's different from what he's talking about. It's just building up your ego illogically, and only according to your emotions and what the unliterary want in their entertainment and in their sorts of fiction. Or perhaps if the unliterary is reading a story, they want to get some use out of it. And he has some version of this for the literary too, where one will claim that poetry or some statement in fiction is, or some work of fiction on its own right, is simply a look on life, and a comment on life, a commentary on life, and perhaps maybe the only story. So back to the unliterary though, perhaps the only stories you like are really just found in newspapers, and you want them to be realistic. You don't want, say, myths or fantasies or any of that kind. It has to be real life, and that helps him to segue into, well, what's the problem with myth, or what's the benefit in it? And then he goes from that to realism, and then to fantasy, and the different ways fantasy can really be defined and categorized. And that's all just a necessary detour that takes up about 3 chapters. And again, this is a short read, so those are pretty short chapters. But following this detour, he goes into the converse arguments for the literary, like I said, and the different kinds there might be. This, of course, is derived from a wise position that of among the literary, there may be some wise people, right? He also talks about how some of the unliterary just kind of get people a little better. Like you could ask a regular old grocer what he thought, maybe even not even of a book, but just of a movie, and it's like, and how foolish you thought certain aspect of it was, maybe like a romance, and it's like, oh well, they got to put that in there. The ladies tend to like it, stuff like that. There are some wise people among the unliterary, and just in the same way, there are some fools among the literary as well. So then he puts forth a survey and a summary of art, but I mean of literature really, but it can be said of art on the whole, and that it can be good or bad, used or received. And he talks about a lot about how there's use which might offer some value for the book, but it doesn't really. But you don't get the whole point of the book itself, and that literature is a very difficult art in itself to judge. But he also brings up the argument of entertainment, which I found very interesting. And he says that we have yet to really produce a sufficient definition of it, much less make it a true aspect of art and literature. Now, should art grab our attention, ensnare our senses, or excite us in such a way that, or just in any way? Well, entertainment, he says, quote, is like a qualifying examination. If a fiction can't provide even that, we may be excused from inquiry into its higher qualities. But of course, what grips one will not grip another. End quote. So, thus, entertainment is really just subjective, and but it's an essential aspect to any work of art, really, any especially of any fiction. It grabs our attention. If you try and derive it by like intra tenere or right entertainment to hold within, to hold or your attention, right, the interior holding or whatever you might want to call it. um, it just means it grabs our attention on its broadest level, and so putting the word mirror before it doesn't really help one's case when trying to qualify works of art, or especially literature or movies. And people will often try and use the argument, what about just being entertained? Okay, well, that's something that we want from all our movies, right? So you can see I love that particular argument among all the rest of them, because it appeals to me as a defender of critiquing good movies. Um, he also talks about poetry afterwards, because he realized he hadn't gotten around to talking about it. Um, but he does have a good segue. Uh, he talks about poetry and its properties and kind of muses upon the reasons why it's dissipating, or it's much less widespread than it used to be in times of antiquity. So he uses the image of grandmothers using it to, in the same way, using lines of poetry, lines of verse, in the same way that their grandmothers used proverbs or scripture, right? We've all met, or at least know, we all know or at least met one of those grandmothers who will just cite, especially the book of Proverbs, to us. So then in the next chapter, right before the epilogue, he poses the experiment itself. And so he enumerates three results. One, that it fixes our attention on reading, or the reception of a work, right? He has this stance that reception is ultimately higher than using a work, and that just makes sense, right? An art, especially a book, is something to be received. It's something that you take in, and ultimately, we as critics have to take something in. We ought to take something in before we say anything about it. Not to mention react to it. We have to take it in, we have to react to it, and then we have to express that reaction somehow. So then the next point is that it allows any work to stand the test of time and the test of culture, so that it may come and go as fashion so pleases. Right? You'll have an occasional film, especially if it has political backing, where everyone's just like, yes, this is the film to go see. Right? No, that's always to go see in theaters. That's you'll get those at least once a year. I believe the most recent was probably the movie Sound of Freedom, right? all the Christians, all the conservatives were like, go see it, it's important, and that's great. That's accurate. We That was a good thing. It was also just that kind of movie that all the tight knit communities were just like, we have to support this film because it's true and it's good, um, and it was done well. Um, I hope to come out with my own thoughts on Sound of Freedom, and because the wave of it has died down, I feel comfortable saying a couple things that I think we should be aware of about not about the film necessarily, but when we have a film that in message we completely agree with, and even if it is done satisfactorily. Um, and then the third point is that it makes critical condemnation difficult to achieve. Uh, Basically, just that critics will say this book is bad, this book is bad, this book is bad, and he wants to defend. Okay, you say that book is bad on what grounds? You might say why, but what about any and all redeeming qualities that the book may try and have to offer? Um, Even if it has ultimately negative content, couldn't there possibly be something to add to one's life? And I'm not saying like to one's philosophy of life, just like his another thing that he'll bring up in the book is that we want art, we want literature to add to our lives, uh, rather than subtract from it. So again, rather than focusing on the content of the story, we ought rather to focus on the story of the story, right? Rather than the little things that we find in the story, we ought to focus on the whole of the story. Um, this ultimately allows for a more accurate and honest reaction to said story from the reader, and helps others to kind of gauge whether they want to read the story, or engage with the story. This provides at least a little more time for truth to come about more naturally, rather than forcibly into culture about the story, about the movie, about the book, about the piece of art. Rather than by critical censure, it's more a cultural thing rather than a critical censure thing. Then finally, the last point with that is that even terrible books, like I said, may provide something which adds rather than subtracts from our lives, which is the basic goal of any piece of art. Now, in this way, I think, especially in this way, I think we can apply it to watching movies. In case you weren't catching my drift earlier, so if we read a movie like we read a book, or maybe even like if we've tried to parse out all the different flavors we taste in liquors or in just a cocktail, that's a little easier to parse out flavors. Uh, it's similar with movies because movies have a visual, an audio, and a storytelling element that a book may not have all three of may not have the visual element like a painting would, or an audio element like a music piece would, right? They're not the same. You can use it. You can make arguments that it is visual and that it is audio if you are using your eyes to look at the words, but the words are just something else to bring to our imaginations, right? To uplift our imaginations. It's not necessarily the words themselves that are the art, although there's an argument that can be made for poetry that does that, but rather the thing beyond the words themselves. Then movies combine all three of them, right? That's why you have all three elements, and you can kind of find little bits here and there that improve the whole of the work. So we arrive to a much better conclusion about the movie than we maybe initially anticipated. There are, of course, other things to think about, but by making the focus of the movie the story, we end up seeing more of the story itself, and all the details start to play. And I especially would hope that filmmakers and writers and directors and all of these people would take this kind of understanding of films as well, so that they can start knowing that their work is not just work, it's an art. So anyway, you can tell I'm I'm rather cutting corners just to make circles around all the details that he does provide, all the examples and all the images. I've produced just a couple of them that I remember. But as I said, I don't want to give anything away. Again, it's a short read. I highly recommend that you go online and order a copy or reread a copy if you got one of those old libraries, of An Experiment in Criticism. Like many books, and I think it'll just help take another step back when it comes to art and give it a second thought. And given Lewis's theological dispositions, it actually backs up behind the Catholic Church's position on art quite well, and so it all works in this channel, and I think that this is the best art critic, or at least the first art critic book one ought to read, just as an introduction to criticizing art, and especially story. Anyway, that's all I have for now. Please pray for me. I'll be praying for you. Go watch movies, and God bless.